Welcome to the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. My name is Dr. Caswell Evans. I'm a past president of the Institute of Medicine of Chicago and a Billings Fellow, and I'm currently an emeritus professor of the University of Illinois at Chicago. Today's topic is of strong interest to me personally and professionally, as I was Associate Dean of Prevention and Public Health Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Dentistry, and also a faculty member at the UIC School of Public Health. I was also proud to serve as a mayoral appointment member of the Chicago Board of Health for 13 years, and also served 2 terms as a gubernatorial appointment member of the Illinois Board of Health. I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. Today's session addresses childhood lead poisoning in the Chicago area, the latest evidence and public health approaches, and it asks the question of how can we continue to correct this issue. This program is part of the Institute of Medicine of Chicago's 2022-2023 programmatic series on public health, population health, community health, reducing health disparities. Chicago has hotspots where lead, including in soil, and is a potential danger to children and others. This is a pressing problem that needs to be addressed to prevent health issues. The air and environment may have elevated lead levels, contributing to and creating overall lead exposure. Urban soils contaminated with lead contribute to elevated blood lead levels in young children. This session will present some of the challenges to address childhood lead exposure and also provide good examples as to how the Lead Abatement Research Center, or LARC, has taken action and achieved quantifiable results. Now let's place this session in context on a national level before we learn about our local issues. The National Institutes of Health reported in an August 30th report of this year that research in elevated lead levels continues to be an issue in children. The NIH findings in its report cite the consequences of elevated lead levels. The Institute of Medicine of Chicago wants to bring attention to this issue and issue a call for action. This is an important issue for many reasons. The NIH reported that racial segregation makes consequences of lead exposure worse. Racial segregation and lead exposure amplified each other's detrimental effects on reading scores in children. The findings could guide interventions aimed at improving children's cognitive development. This finding also adds to the growing evidence that residential segregation can contribute to racial disparities in health. As an example, the NIH-funded research team from Duke University, Rice University, and the University of Notre Dame linked detailed birth records with lead screening and standardized testing scores for almost 26,000 children in North Carolina. The children were all born in the year 2000. The researchers also developed a measure of racial residential segregation in different areas. Results appeared in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on August 23rd of this year. Overall, non-Hispanic Black children had higher median blood lead levels when compared to non-Hispanic white children. More than 80% of the Black children experienced economic disadvantage. Black children also lived in areas with greater racial residential segregation compared to white children. Today's agenda includes a presentation from the Lead Abatement Research Center, or LARC, a nonprofit foundation located in Chicago, as well as a presentation from the Region 5 U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The presentations will be followed by a question and answer session with the panelists. There's also a follow-up call to contact the Lead Abatement Resource Center on how to participate as a strategic partner or as a volunteer in their activities. It is our pleasure to welcome 3 highly accomplished speakers. I will be brief in the introductions to allow time for their very full and detailed presentations. The full bios of today's outstanding speakers can be found on the IOMC event webpage of the website. Dr. Shirley Conabear is a board-certified physician in family medicine and occupational medicine. She's an epidemiologist and senior scientist with a master's degree in public health, and she's vice president of LARC, of the LARC Foundation, and is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. Dr. Brian Savasas is an occupational and environmental medicine physician, also with a master's in public health, and he's a board member of the LARC Foundation and also a fellow of the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. Ms. Deborah Shore is the Regional 5 Administrator with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and is the Great Lakes National Program Manager of EPA. She has substantial experience in environmental sciences. Our 3 learning objectives for today follow. First, explain why children lead poisoning has not been eliminated with the banning of lead in gasoline. Second, identify current barriers and lead sources in soil and water. And third, cite some of the practical measures that are or can be implemented from a regulatory and practice approach regarding elevated lead levels in lead in soil. Now, if you're visiting for the first time, we conduct monthly virtual sessions, except during the months of July and August. This fall, the Institute of Medicine of Chicago expects to begin our work groups for fellows only. And please stay tuned for more information on how to become involved with IOMC as a fellow. If you're not a fellow and would like more information on membership, please contact Deborah Hodges, who's the association manager and program manager, and her email address is iomcstaff@iomc.org. This session is accredited by Rush University. A continuing education credit is available by completing the online survey after this session. Your certificate of completion will be immediately available upon submission of the online evaluation. A copy of the PPT will be made available in our follow-up email with the evaluation. All session planners and speakers have completed a financial disclosure consent form. This information is on file for review. There are no conflicts of interest. Now, if you're visiting with us for the first time, here is a review of the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. The Institute of Medicine of Chicago is an independent nonprofit organization of distinguished leaders in the health field who collaborate to improve the health of the public. Drawing upon the expertise of diverse members and regional leaders, the IOMC addresses critical health issues through a range of interdisciplinary approaches, including education, research, communication of trusted information, and community engagement. Now, before we begin our presentations, as a quick reminder that on November 18th, the IOMC will host a virtual session titled, "How do we eliminate racism in environmental projects and community development?" This virtual session will address lessons learned from the RMG metal scrap company from the near north side to Hedgewich with Peter Orris, Dr. Peter Orris from the University of Illinois. Now that we have the context and educational matters addressed, I'd like to ask Dr. Brian Savasas to begin with the Lead Abatement Resource Center's presentation. Dr. Savasas.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. So I've got the lead off here for the talk and hopefully give you some context on lead and its effects on childhood. And of course, starting out with a statement from the CDC about best practices in childhood lead abatement. So primary prevention is key. I won't read that entire statement, but the key thing is that the large letters that say prevention. So we're looking at primary prevention here because once there's lead in the system of the child, it can take a while to chelate, and things don't turn over so quickly in, for instance, the bone compartment. So I'm going to explore some of the risk factors, as Dr. Evans had pointed out, that it is a consequence of where you live in Chicagoland. There's good evidence of looking at hotspots via zip codes. Also, we've seen the clusters along highway tracks, or at least historical highway tracks, and I'll get into that in a minute about why that is so. It is also a consequence of how you live. You know, whether you do a lot of outdoor play, exposed to a lot of the environment, the soils, play yards, be they public play yards or your personal play yard in the backyard. Gardening, lead has a propensity to attract into green leafy vegetables. And of course, that's something that some proponents have said, well, you know, there might be a way to do phytoremediation, have it go into the green leafy vegetables, cut those down and then store them, and you still got to get rid of that. So the best way is if we can find some way to in situ get rid of that lead or at least get that lead out of play. Also, there's been some articles about backyard chickens. Everybody's kind of interested in backyard chickens and raising eggs. It's also found its way into some of the eggs of these backyard chickens. And then also it's a consequence of methods of cleaning, whether it is a broom or a vacuum that one uses to clean house. And then also the doormats seem to be a good source of lead as people enter and exit the home. So some of those more subtle differences can make a difference, but certainly I'll get into a lot of the where you live type of questions. Getting to some of the learning objectives, lead is persistent. It is a safe, stable substance. It is the last leg of the decay chain for any of the radioactive substances. It itself is not radioactive, but it tends to last a long time in the environment. We have ways that we can maybe bind it to something else, but once it's there until you do something about it. The other insidious thing is that it mimics calcium and iron in terms of metabolism. And of course, the children are very avid in terms of uptake of their calcium and iron as they have their growing bodies. Also, the GI tract of the children is not as well developed. It transits the GI tract quite readily, and again, owes to increased lead burden in the children. So I see the slide is up for the lead burden in Chicago. In 2017, Chicago was one of the highest in terms of lead poisoning rates with the city of Chicago, one of the top reporting tracks. Children of color, low income, and with limited access communities disproportionately at risk. These cluster areas are the west side, the south side, and the far south side, all traditionally Black neighborhoods. And it is a multidisciplinary matter spanning environmental justice, health, and safety. Additionally, those tracts that I've mentioned, the west, south, and far south, tend to be older homes. There's also a known risk factor that whether you have home ownership or you're dealing with a landlord makes a big difference in terms of the maintenance of the home, access to repair or replacement of various items within the home. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, the appetite for the calcium and iron. So food disparities make a big difference in terms of how well or how poorly that lead is going to be taken up by the children. If there's a good diet, there may not be as much lead accumulated as opposed to one that is someone that's malnourished. A word of housekeeping in my parens, that's a citation. So I have it by page number is the first number, and then the dash is actually the point that I'm making. So at the end of my talk, there'll be all the citations there in case you want to do further reading or try to keep me honest. Moving on to the routes of lead entry into the body. Lead can get into the body by water contamination. One thing that's gotten a lot of press recently, direct ingestion from contaminated soil. I've got a little 2-year-old granddaughter who loves to just put everything in her mouth, and that's been the case for some time, so I can attest to that. Ingestion from contaminated soil from dust on floors, shoes, clothing, and pets. and inhaling lead from contaminated airborne dust particles. The lead levels are found high amongst the house foundations. Some of that is due to paint residue. If you scrape the paint off the house, then where's it going to fall? Gravity's going to take it down to the down towards the foundation. Also, there's many studies that show that atmospheric lead settles out and comes out of suspension when it hits the walls of the house and lands there in the side lot. And of course, where do children play? Oftentimes in the side lots of the homes, particularly in the smaller lots that I've addressed in Chicago. No talk about lead would be complete without talking about the impact of water. A word about water in Chicago. Tried to search for a lot of scholarly articles regarding water in Chicago, but probably the best one comes from this Tribune source, sourced by Hawthorne and Reyes. And it talks about randomly sampling the lead levels coming out of tap water throughout Chicago. And this was found to exceed the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in a great deal of cases. So certainly with the pipes, there's some sequestration of the lead over time, meaning that there's some overlay inside the pipes that doesn't allow the lead to leach out. And I know I'm a big fan of National Geographic. They had talked about the Romans and whether there was a lot of lead in their bones, and they were known famously to have the lead water pipes. But it only takes a mishap like Flint, Michigan to bring to mind that in the right conditions, that lead can be remobilized out of those pipes and become available. So certainly the water sampling in Chicago certainly bears that out, and it's something that certainly needs to be addressed. Now, sources of lead pollution in the soil and routes of entry into the body, there's sources in the soil. So these are the consequence of industrial sites, smelters, factories, what Peter Orris is going to talk about on the next segment, where they're either burning off leaded paint to scrap metal, or taking in metal scrap. Soils contaminated by scraping or flaking of exterior leaded paint. And then a very important one is the lead particles emitted from the pre-1982 vehicles. And of course, that's one of the learning objectives, is that, okay, where did all that lead go from when we had tetraethyl lead, which was the additive that was added to the gasoline to help the engine run better, also served as a lubricant. And of course, that was engineered out and legislated out. And so fortunately, we're no longer burning the tetraethyl lead gasoline, but it certainly had an impact. And so if you look at things like some of the housing tracts, especially for the Chicago Housing Authority, some of those were sited along the expressways, mainly because there was the space available. That was a good place to site them. But unfortunately, that was where a lot of this tetraethyl lead historically had settled out. So that causes quite a bit of problems. There's improper demolition of old buildings containing leaded paint. And, one of the things our group was working with was a homeowner in Oak Park, where there was lead paint sandblasted off the home, unfortunately. One of the things that we were talking about in the planning meetings for this presentation was, okay, do we emphasize the paint lead, the industrial sourced lead, the tetraethyl lead from the gasoline? And of course, like many of the yard signs that proclaim love is love, I think we should say lead is lead. It doesn't matter necessarily how it got there, but you have to deal with it once it's there and in the soils. The geek in me, I'm a physics undergrad, so the geek in me likes the fact that there's isotopes where you can see whether the lead came from paint or tetraethyl lead. But this is useful at looking at maybe analyzing why there's certain hot spots, what were the sources. But the bottom line is you've got that lead and you need to take care of that. And either one is going to be the same biological fate. It's still going to get into the body and cause these untoward effects. Which brings me to my next slide, which is lead in children. Lead exposure is a risk factor for behavioral disorders such as ADHD, delinquency, learning defects, diminished intellectual abilities. Later in life, as well as in the children, there's the other health problems. very small increases in lead in children on the order of going in the range of 1 to 10 micrograms per deciliter of blood lead level range can equate to 7.4 decrease in IQ on average. So of course, those of you that are, public health trained or know the numbers and such, there's going to be that bell curve. And so there's going to be people that are on that leading edge, unfortunately, of that bell curve, where there'll be bigger diminution in IQ points. So loss of just a few IQ points is likely to shift the entire population, as I explained. And in some Chicago neighborhoods, the elevated blood lead levels, even minimal, are placing the children at risk for lowered IQ with the preschool population, again, because those are the ones that are more avaricious about wanting the minerals and also are getting into the soils and such, are the most vulnerable. And just a word about, my career as an occupational medicine physician. Wherever I worked, I had to find out, okay, what was normal for the lead. So I knew how I was protecting my population if we were doing better than the norms. And when I first started my career in California, Alameda County had 7 microgram per deciliter normal range, and of course, now we're talking of levels that are far much lower than that, fortunately. And also a few things that have evolved over time is that, we've got better testing. At that time period, if you were below 10 micrograms per deciliter, the error was 6 points, micrograms plus or minus around that. So a very large error bar. Nobody would really like that for testing. But now it has become much, 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 much more precise, and we can are we able to detect much greater differences in terms of the lead. And then also there's been many sweeping population studies, sort of as Dr. Coswell had introduced with, that where they look at, okay, census tracts, lead levels, and then what are the consequences. And then the other one that's very exciting is the functional MRI studies that are showing that there's effects of the lead on the prefrontal cortex. So that's the thing that gives you impulse control. So more likely maybe to have criminal activity, maybe not as likely to sit still in school. So there's far-reaching effects. And to the uninitiated, they would say, oh, well, we're far better off now than we were back, 20 years, 30 years ago. Well, in some ways we are, but we're finding that no level is really a safe level for lead in children. So going to the next slide, which is the estimated costs of environmentally mediated diseases in the US, you can see lead poisoning, which is in red there, is topping the list. It's a whopping 60.6 billion in terms of cost. And of course, we look at the societal costs, but also what is that cost to the individual that's not going to have as fulfilling a life due to some of the problems they have with the lead poisoning early in life. So brings me to the next slide, which is the estimated benefit and savings achieved by reducing the blood levels. And this kind of struck me as a real dichotomy. So you could look at this in terms of societal costs, and you could look at it as an altruistic type of cost, much like I said, when you bring it down to the individual level. So, there's the lifetime earnings decreased by 165 to 233 billion. There's the healthcare costs, tax revenue, again, where that can get rolled back into, treating other diseases in the community, addressing other issues. That in itself is taking that much money. The direct cost of crime, the cost of special education, again, where, there's a lot of the Head Start programs where, they have to overcome some inertia, if you will. If there are some learning disabilities already, think of how far they could go, these people could go if they weren't, it's getting that slow out of the starting blocks. And then the ADHD costs as well. So the bottom line on this is that for every dollar that's invested, there's about a $17 to $221 range of benefit that is achieved by reducing the burden of the lead exposure in childhood. So, and then this next slide, which is very busy, is kind of a barometer or thermometer, if you will. So the best way to read this is the red box that you see down there at the bottom. That's a very large number. That was representing the lead level at that given point in time before we started getting some of the maternal fetal type of measurements going on. Each one of these interventions is water regulations, air regulations. And what you can see is that the lead levels, as we go towards the top, which is more towards the present, you can see that red box getting smaller and smaller, fortunately. But from what I've told you on the previous slides, there's probably not a red box that we really want to tolerate as a society. We want that red box to be as small as possible. And again, these are kind of things that are kind of average. So I call this slide, if you regulate it, it will decrease. And that's somewhat true, but there's always going to be outliers. As we mentioned, there's these hot spots in Chicago. So not everybody comes along for when you have these decreases. And then also there's the law of unintended consequences. And so, for instance, if there is some proposed regulation, for instance, one of the things we run into is a homeowner's fear of analysis of their soils for fear that, oh, this is going to impact resale. Oh, now I got to do something about it. Well, you know, knowledge is power to a certain extent, that it is good to know. And, you know, there's some of the regulations are going to be more for the industrial sites, which again, we kind of breathe all that same air in drier atmospheres, climates that lead tends to blow around. So certainly if you're adjacent to industry, you know, you want them to be regulated so that their soils aren't as contaminated, because eventually that's not going to necessarily respect that border or boundary. So that said, going on to the lead regulatory status, and that's talking about soil, lead contaminated soil can pose a risk through direct ingestion. And of course, there's all those nifty things of the x-ray of the child with the lead chip and then the 300 microgram blood lead level. And of course, that is very dramatic. But you know, increasingly what's being seen and which has more of an impact on the population is the uptake that's, again, like I said, more of an insidious type of thing, where there's uptake via the vegetable gardens or tracking into homes, and children with soiled hands crawling around on the floor, you know, putting it in their mouth or putting toys in their mouth. These are things that we need to try to get a better control on. And, you know, I know Chicago, for any of the community gardens that are officially sanctioned, they have to raise those beds so that they're not putting it in direct contact with the soil. But so much of our life depends on just the exposed soil. So soil contains a lead concentration of about 50 parts per million. Again, as I mentioned, that was a decay product of things that were on the earth long ago. So it's, you know, usually you're not going to see it usually lower than that amount. But the soil levels in many of the urban areas exceed 200 parts per million. And certainly a lot of the areas that have been remediated by LARC are far in excess of that. The EPA has a standard for bare soil and play areas at 400 parts per million. And then 1,200 parts per million for the non-play areas. And I know one of the things that was discussed you know, before this call was that, you know, some of the European countries are pushing their, you know, standards down lower, approaching more that 50, that natural type of soil concentration. You know, we're going to go here in this country or in this state, I'm not sure. The soil screening levels for lead represent a conservative estimate for a level that would be protective of public health and residential soils based on an analysis of direct ingestion pathway for children. So, you know, them putting the soil in their mouths. This value is for guidance and is not enforceable. So the thing to take home on that is then it's not, you know, necessarily, you know, the average homeowner that's got the backyard plot that's kind of interested in what their soil conditions are. I think it's good to know, but you know, they're not necessarily going to end up with the feds or the state, you know, in their backyard. So I think that's an important take-home lesson. And then the last slide was just my references, and people can feel free to peruse that. This Dr. Milkey has done a number of studies. He's the third one there, 3-3. Done a number of studies, Philadelphia, New Orleans, you know, all over the country, and a good wealth of knowledge of what the impact is of the lead soil and how it impacts children and how it gets into their system. So with that, I will pass off to Dr. Evans, and you can introduce the next speaker.
Dr. Savasas, thank you so much for that review and reminding us of the complexity of the challenge before us. Thank you very much. I'd like to now.
Dr. Evans, I think you're still on mute.
Well,
you're not coming through.
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, because I was not on mute, but perhaps there was a technical problem. So I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and reminding us of the complexity of the problem that we're facing. And I'd like now to turn to Dr. Conibert, also of the Lead Abatement Resource Center, for her presentation. Dr. Conibert.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Evans. I'm going to tell you a story about an effort to apply primary prevention methodology to the problem of lead poisoning in children due to soil contaminations in their environment. It began with an SBTTR grant awarded in partnership with NORC, the National Opinion Research Company at University of Chicago. SBTTR, as the slide shows, is the Small Business Technology Transfer Grant, and it promotes projects that scale up inventions or patented materials that are at the laboratory or bench level and have not been brought into production or commerce. The NORC portion was to perform a research survey of possible users of a amendment product in the Chicago area. And they did a sample of landscapers, home and property owners in the public sector, gardeners, and others who might be have interest in the material. The technical part was done by LARC, and we used mined gypsum rock and crushed fish bones to look for the efficiency of each of these products. And we did get encouraging results. And this implied that other waste streams such as construction waste, wallboard, flue gas derived gypsum, and fish bones could be effective soil amendments that were environmentally safe and effective. However, each had its advantages and disadvantages, which the next slide will summarize. The first three are easily understood and fairly practical with a somewhat clear pathway to mitigate. The next one, the perception of potential users, far and away proved to be the biggest barrier to use of amendments of these types. And we encountered it in almost every situation. The general lack of awareness of the public health hazards, the next bullet point, is connected to the perception. I think people don't really want to hear about it, but certainly is more amenable to mitigation. So this led us to the understanding that to address the issue of abating soil from a primary prevention standpoint, more than science was going to be needed. Next slide, please. This is just a quick summary for those of you who are not familiar with this, of the soil amendments that in kind of a history going from top to bottom. Triple superphosphate has been banned because of eutrophication of waterways. Same for the calcium phosphate. And the biosolids, but they also had the problem of introducing other contaminations such as heavy metals. The super processed biosolids is a new product that is come on the market, which we're very, very excited about. It's a waste product from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, and I'm sure that Deborah Shore could say way more about it than I can, but we're excited about the use of this. It eliminates many of the problems of the other amendments, the ROC amendments, because of its packaging for the individual farmer or homeowner. And it's called low cost compared to Appetite 2, which is the bottom one, which has been accepted as a Superfund amendment. And it also mitigates lead, cadmium, zinc, and nickel. Next slide, please. So in 2012, we evolved into, LARC evolved into a 501c3 operating foundation, enabling us to pursue a broad variety of activities. And these are the four areas of interest in terms of facilitating meaningful partnerships. Next slide, please. I want to talk here about the picture. This is a picture of a lot in Englewood where a home was torn down, and it's this is the gray material in the background near the fence is Appetite 2. This is fish bones that have been ground up. They come from the fishery in Alaska. And they are they're nanoized so that they have a tremendous surface area, and that's probably the mechanism by which they are able to work more efficiently and effectively than the rock, which is crystalline. This guy is using just a home gardener type rototiller, and is rototilling the fish bones into the soil to a depth of about 6 inches. He's wearing a N95 respirator, but we had a certified industrial hygienist taking air samples during this project, and there was lead was non-detectable. So probably in part because of the outdoor environment, but also because the lead is not it's not a good way to create dust. So we don't recommend the use of N95 particulate respirators when doing this kind of abatement. It's a homeowner friendly task, and that's one of the benefits. Next slide, please. So I want to talk mostly about item number 6, interdisciplinary participation of engineering, soil science, and healthcare professionals. When we started this project, the physicians didn't know what a soil scientist was. I guess it's obvious, but so gradually we've accumulated people on our board that are involved in different aspects of this. It's not typical for even public health professionals, I think, to think of soil as soil, what soil contains as a science, but of course it actually is. So we've acquired a multidisciplinary board, and we're always looking for partnerships. Next slide, please. So we are very optimistic about the potential to raise public awareness of the issue of lead in soil. Lead has been front and center for a number of years for paint, of course, and then for, unfortunately, water. Occupational medicine is a story of terrible things that have happened, which have galvanized people to finally accept them as problems and regulate. In fact, OSHA was created because of in part because of a terrible mine accident. So in that way, things have developed that have made this more possible, we feel. I recently learned that Benjamin Franklin actually at some point had lead poisoning, and this caused him to do some research. And of course, it goes way back to Roman times. And he concluded the same thing that we've concluded, that primary prevention is hard. So I think that this sort of gives me hope that we're not just beating our head against a wall, that we need to soldier on. And times are the current state of the science, I think, is at a point where we can really begin to address the issue of how to mitigate lead in soil. Next slide, please. To that end, we are looking for partners and volunteers who want to work with us of all types. And I urge you to contact us if you're interested, or if you have an issue or problem that we might be able to help with. That concludes my remarks. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to present this story, and special shout out to all of the soil scientists and environmental engineers who might be out there listening. We welcome your input, and you're critical to this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Conabare. I appreciate I think we all appreciate your information about these particular mitigation options, and also your review of LARC and your call out for partners and collaborators and a more multidisciplinary involvement in your effort. So we appreciate that. At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Deborah Shaw, who again is with Region 5 Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Great Lakes National Program Manager of EPA. So Ms. Shaw will turn the proceedings over to you.
Thank you, and appreciate your putting the first slide up. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Evans. As mentioned, I'm Deborah Shore, Regional Administrator for US EPA, Region 5, based in Chicago. Discussions like the one we're having today on this important and timely topic are critical to our continued efforts to protect public health and the environment here in Chicago and beyond. Next slide. Unlike many of you, I am neither a doctor, nor a scientist, nor an engineer. Rather, I consider myself a writer, a former editor, a public servant, and an enthusiast. As Region 5 Administrator, I was appointed by President Biden to lead approximately 1,000 EPA scientists, engineers, lawyers, and other staff in our efforts to protect human health and the environment across our 6-state region, which also includes 35 tribal nations. I'll note that I'm no stranger to Chicago. As mentioned prior to this job, I served as an elected member of the Board of Commissioners of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, the billion-dollar agency responsible for wastewater treatment and stormwater management for more than 5 million people, serving not only the residents of Chicago, but also 129 other municipalities. My goal today is to give you a sense of EPA's priorities in President Biden's administration with a focus on environmental justice and also what we're doing to combat childhood lead poisoning across the country, but more specifically here in Region 5. Next slide. At the Environmental Protection Agency, we define environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. It's no secret that some communities experience a disproportionate level of pollution from industry sullying the air, contaminating water, and leaving toxic chemicals in the soil. These communities are largely lower income and often populated by people of color or indigenous peoples, in addition to sometimes being small and rural. The residents have too often been disenfranchised, their voices dismissed and disregarded when decisions are made that affect their communities. The impacts from climate change further compound the struggles these communities face. I'm proud that environmental justice is finally taking its rightful place in the work of EPA and the entire federal government, not as an add-on or an afterthought, but as a central driving factor in all that we do. For the first time in our nation's history, the federal government has set a goal to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities through the Justice 40 initiative. And thanks to President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, we are making historic investments in communities overburdened by pollution to solve many legacy environmental justice issues. And lead is at the forefront of these efforts. Next slide. One of the major components of the bipartisan infrastructure law is the single largest investment in water, $50 billion, that the federal government has ever made. One of the most challenging infrastructure problems we're facing is lead in drinking water and its effect on children. Thankfully, a portion of the infrastructure funding is dedicated to replacing lead service lines. EPA estimates that 6 to 10 million homes in the country have lead service lines, and Chicago, as you know, has an estimated 400,000. It's not just family homes that have lead service lines, but schools and childcare facilities also need to be upgraded. By focusing our attention on these homes and facilities, we can help protect vulnerable communities and children from the negative health effects of lead exposure. Illinois will receive nearly $107 million in bill funding for lead service line replacement this year. And I want to stress that this is in addition to the other federal funding the state has received and is dedicating to this effort. The infrastructure law is also investing $5.4 billion in cleaning up legacy pollution at Superfund and brownfield sites, including lead contaminated sites. Next slide. All of this is great news for those living in Region 5, especially our more populated and industrialized areas like Chicago and Northwest Indiana. But it's critical that we deploy these funds responsibly and in a way that helps the most vulnerable. In December 2018, a federal task force on environmental health risks to children released the federal lead action plan. From there, federal agencies developed their own lead strategy, including EPA. And the agency's draft was released last October and focuses on 3 main paths to reducing lead exposures. Locally, with focus on communities with disparities and promoting environmental justice. Nationally, through protective standards analytical tools and outreach, and through a whole of EPA and whole of government approach. EPA held a series of lead listening sessions, including here in Region 5, to gather feedback on the draft strategy. That feedback, as well as other comments received, informed revisions to the draft strategy, which is anticipated to be finalized in the coming months. EPA's draft strategy incorporates the funding and objectives of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It also builds on some of the lessons that we've learned, such as at the USS Lead site in East Chicago, Indiana. Region 5 has the highest number of lead contaminated sites of any EPA region. And because of that, we've been on the forefront of many of our country's lead challenges. And Region 5, certainly in the Chicagoland area, has a rich industrial history. But an unfortunate relic of that history is the legacy contamination that it left behind. The funding from the infrastructure law will be and already has been a major boost to the cleanup work Region 5 and our partners have been engaged in. This year, we received almost $20 million in infrastructure funds, in addition to the annual budget, to accelerate cleanup at the Jacobsville Superfund site in Indiana and Matheson and Hegler site in Illinois. With these funds, we expect to clean up 250 additional residential properties between the two sites. Next slide. More detailed, this slide gives you a snapshot of some recent lead remediation work we've done in the region. But this one slide doesn't do justice to the resources that go into soil remediation efforts. Frequent challenges we face when conducting these types of cleanups include cost, time, gaining access to properties, and the existence of other sources of lead, like lead paint on homes, contributing to contaminated yards. Another challenge we face is finding enough clean soil to replace the contaminated soil we remove. We call this replacement soil fill. The further we have to travel to get clean fill, the higher the cost and the longer it takes. EPA generally does not clean sites below the naturally occurring and anthropogenic levels of lead, also referred to as background levels, because doing so is not cost effective. It's also not technically feasible, and sites are highly likely to become recontaminated. Right now, EPA is considering adjusting the current levels for lead soil remediation because the standards we're still using were set in 1994. Since then, the science surrounding the effects of lead exposure, especially for children and other vulnerable populations, has evolved. And today, as has been said, we know there's no safe level of lead. We don't know exactly where our current policy discussions will land, but I can tell you they will be lower and perhaps significantly lower. We recognize that removing lead and reducing exposures wherever we can are the best path forward to be protective of public health. EPA's lead renovation, repair, and painting rule requires renovators who disturb lead-based paint in homes, in childcare facilities, and preschools built before 1978 to be certified by EPA. As part of the agency's program, Region 5 provides trainings to ensure that renovators are using lead-safe practices. Next slide. I want to touch on an innovative study that EPA recently conducted with the state of Michigan and published in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives in July. The goal was to develop a blueprint to identify areas with high rates of children's elevated blood lead levels at a census tract level. The study, which contributes to the goals of both the federal lead action plan and EPA's draft lead strategy, is the first of its kind to zero in on blood lead levels at such a granular level. And it provides a screening approach using a number of pre-existing data sources and tools to inform efforts to target and reduce lead exposure. Michigan has robust blood lead level data that we used in concert with other data sources and geospatial tools. But for states where such data is not as robust, a combination of available lead indices can be used to identify high potential lead exposure locations based on old housing stock and socio-demographic indicators. Next slide. Our analysis confirms known lead hotspot locations and revealed new ones at finer geographic resolution than previously available by using two different statistical methods, a top 20s percentiles method and an advanced geospatial statistical cluster analysis. The figure on the left displays the 306 census tracts across 11 reference locations identified by the cluster analysis using 2014 to 2016 data. This method identified clusters of census tracts with high percentages of elevated blood lead levels, which tend to be located in urban areas. The table in the middle lists the 11 reference locations, the number of census tracts with elevated blood lead levels, the exceedance rate, and total populations of children below the age of 6 years old. Locations with the highest percent of elevated blood lead levels included anywhere from 4 to 190 census tracts and were home to anywhere from 643 to 39,000 children. In total, more than 74,000 children lived in the identified clusters. The figure on the right shows both the cluster analysis shaded in yellow, the top 20 percentile shaded in blue, and where the two analyses overlap, shaded in red. The top 20 percentile method helped to identify rural or sparsely populated areas that were not identified by the cluster method. This study helps us focus our efforts and our resources where they're needed most by using the tools and data we already have. And by making these connections, whether it's within EPA or with our partner organizations, we are creating streamlined processes which will help us all reduce exposures more efficiently. Another tool that we're using is monitoring to inform enforcement. Last November, we cited Republic Steel in Canton, Ohio for excessive lead air emissions. The Republic Steel facility is located in a historically overburdened community with at least 3 schools within a mile. Industry has a responsibility to comply with our federal regulations and a responsibility to the people who work at their facilities and who live nearby. And we at EPA have a responsibility to follow the science and hold industry accountable when companies fail to meet their environmental obligations. I know we're close to running out of time, so I'm just going to skip a little bit ahead and say that the science is still out on what the best way to reduce lead exposure is. We know lead service lines are a source, but they're not the only source. And that's why it's more important than ever for us to reduce exposures anywhere and everywhere we can. To do that, EPA is focused on working with our federal partners like HUD and ATSDR, our state partners like Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and local partners like UIC. By sharing our resources and knowledge, we can develop better approaches to addressing legacy contamination and modern day sources. I want to thank you all again for convening this session and facilitating these critical conversations, and look forward to working with you to address our big problems. Thank you.
I want to thank you for your presentation. You have enlightened us and you have encouraged us with some of the interventions that you have outlined, and also your underscoring of the need for a multifaceted, multi-community approach, and particularly the important role of industry in our prevention and abatement issues as well. I think we may have time for a few questions from our participants. I think the chat is open. And rather than my posting a question, I think it's more important that our participants have an opportunity to do so. So Deborah, are you following those questions? Because I haven't been able to follow them. Deborah?
Yeah, sure,
Um,
Dr. Evans, I can present the question, and then whomever our panelists feel that it's
Yes,
most
please do
appropriate to
so.
answer. Okay,
Please do so.
all right. From Stephen Brown, are hospitals required to report the street address of buildings where a patient's elevated lead levels have been found? Okay, it looks like that'd be a question we'll follow up on.
Mhm.
I know
Right, we have
my experience, at least from the industrial side of things is, and of course, no good deed goes unpunished. Over the years, I've had people ask, when we do wellness exams, could we do a lead, for them? And I know that the labs go back to the source of the person that actually sent the result in, and then they try to track it down from there. So I know I've had a very angry employer that was like, well, why were you drawing a lead on this person? They're not, involved in lead. So I know they do track it right back to where the blood was drawn. And from there, they'll get that additional information. So, so I guess that's an answer, is that yes. So in other words, if you had it done at Quest in Lombard, then they're going to go back to Quest and they're going to say, okay, we had this elevated lead level. Then it's incumbent on Quest to go ahead and report out, okay, where did this person come from? So that's kind of how that comes about, in my experience.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, from Dr. Mark Shields, comment on the removal of soil versus treatment of soil with fish bones as strategies, any of the panelists.
It depends on definitely on the level. So what the amendments that we're using are not suitable for above the EPA action level of 800 parts per million. Other than that, the amendment depends upon pH and whether or not it's what the chemical moiety is that the lead. So it's each site has to be treated individually.
All right, if not, I'm sure there'll be another question, in full. From Stephen Brown, since we know that the most sensitive population is children under 4, can we forbid landlords from renting to families with these children?
I don't know if we can prevent landlords. That would take action by the city council. I doubt that would be successful. I think another approach would be to provide incentives for landlords to engage in lead abatement. Let's provide encouragement and support and ways to remove lead from dwellings. It'll enhance their property values and be a good thing all around.
Wonderful. Okay, that's a wonderful response. Okay, another question. Does Ms. Shore have a geo map for lead in Illinois and Chicago? From Dr. Janice Benson.
I will find out and get back to you. Are you interested in lead service lines principally, or dispersal of lead across the landscape?
We don't know. She'll have to put another comment in the question box or the chat box in order to for us to pick that up. I do have a question for the LARC Foundation. What kind of projects can volunteers be expected to participate with the LARC Foundation?
Well, it depends on what their skill set is and their knowledge. We have actually worked with the Boy Scouts, the Eagle Scouts, and helped them devise projects that could be done by them. It didn't involve any field work because, of course, they're the oversight by the organization didn't want them to be out in the field at all. But there's something that most everybody can do. So it depends on what their skill set is.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Conover. To go back to Administrator Shore, Dr. Janice Benson says dispersal across the landscape, if that will help you answering that question on the GeoMap.
So I will be happy to find out and get back to her and provide the answer to the Institute.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Dr. Evans, that, from what I can see, that concludes all the questions that we have at this time.
Well, very nice. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And on behalf of the Institute of Medicine of Chicago, it was quite a pleasure to have this distinguished panel and all of the participants in this webinar. And I want to particularly, again, thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Conover, Dr. Savasas, and Ms. Shore. You have informed us mightily in terms of the challenge and the opportunities that we face in terms of reducing the lead burden in our communities, and particularly the effect upon children and those in more disadvantaged communities. I just want to point out that the overall attendance for the IOMC series of virtual sessions has surpassed over 1,200 attendees in the past year. So we very much appreciate your future planning to continue with these sessions and look forward to your participation in further, in additional future IOMC activities. You can certainly follow the IOMC on LinkedIn. The IOMC has a blog, and you can visit the IOMC website for more details. So on behalf of the IOMC, I wish to again thank our participants, thank our distinguished panel, and wish you all a good day and have a most enjoyable weekend. Thank you.